All is good in the world. All is right in the world. Doug Neill's in the house.
What's up, buddy?
What's up, bro? Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to be here, to share conversation, insights, and creative inspiration for anybody and everybody who's tuning in.
Thanks, man. I'm excited to be here.
Doug, you are an excellent human being. We've known each other for maybe 7 years.
Sounds about right.
How do you answer that question when somebody asks you in the elevator, Doug, what do you do?
Oh gosh, what do I do? I would say that I'm an online educator. So I kind of would say that I'm a teacher first, is how I tend to think about it. And I just happen to work in the online world. And the skill that I teach is a skill called sketchnoting, which is kind of a newish term that's only been around for like about a decade now. But another good way to describe that is visual note taking, basically incorporating more sketches and diagrams and a bit of color just into the way that you work with ideas. So whether you're a student in college taking notes or a professional going to conferences or taking the minutes at a meeting or something like that, having more of a diverse tool set to learn something new or solve problems or share ideas too, if you're given a presentation. So that definitely wasn't an elevator pitch. I feel like the online education piece was there, but then if it's that question of, and what do you teach? Then it's like, then I can kind of just keep going. But
amazing.
That's a start.
Yeah, because I think that even I think in your description for where the video is being posted, I just put teacher. Because at one point I did have like online entrepreneur, online educator, but then I thought to myself, like, with how much information people are learning from like through the computer or through online, there's not a black and white separation between learning something like purely from the internet or through the computer versus like through people, because it's just so intertwined. And the way that we met like was in person, and you've met some of your students in person. I know that you not only teach, but you also get hired to come to conferences and events to create visual representations of what's being spoken about. And you're teaching then in person in those scenarios. So it's humble of you to say online educator, but you're just an educator, man. You're a teacher, you're an inspirer, because there's so many people who, through what you've shown them, both online and offline, have then taken those skills and inspirations and taken them into the real world. I guess that would be another thing that I would say about Doug. Doug, you've been hired to create illustrations in published books. You get brought out to conferences and large events to take big ideas and try to bring them into a couple beautiful images that you put together. You've worked on commercial projects as well. I remember there was something that you did with Burgerville, right?
I did do a thing with Burgerville
a while ago. So a creative career is I think maybe like a category that we could put you into, but like myself as well, like, I work in the creative arts. So I find it really interesting the way that you've, created what it is that you do for a living, but also as the way that you kind of give back to like the universe through the way that you teach and what you teach.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's an interesting world too, just some of the things you mentioned about, I feel like the way in which the skills that I teach can be used are incredibly diverse. So like you mentioned a few of the ways, whether it be, going to some sort of a live event and using your visual processing skills to capture some of what's going on at that event and help share the ideas, give people like a common reference point, whether it be a conference or some annual meeting for an organization, which is work that I dip my toe in like that water. I don't do any of that work now. I'm kind of solely focused on the education piece, just because I feel like that's what lands at my sweet spot. But there's a whole, even like when I first got into it, the entire profession of graphic recording and graphic facilitation. That's like a well-established profession that like I didn't even know existed until I got into this world of people that do that go to events to provide that service. But then even outside of that, there's like people writing books who want to, be able to share their ideas more effectively, and people doing podcasts that want a nice like visual summary for each of their episodes. Or there's so much information now that's being shared in a variety of settings that I don't see the demand for like the type of the work that I do and I enjoy teaching. I kind of only see the demand going up for that because of the amount of information that's out there. And yeah, I think in life generally, the one of the hardest questions isn't like finding information about a topic. It's kind of synthesizing that information down and then doing something useful with it. So it's an interesting space to be in. So I enjoy exploring kind of as many aspects of it as I can while trying to find like my where I feel like I can do the most good, do the best work, and spend most of my time there.
And what you were just saying with how there's only more information being made available for people either to learn or to be entertained by. And one of the things that I think I've been learning about myself, and I'm curious as to where like your thoughts have gone around this idea, is I tend to have memory that's very much associated with something visual, where I can read a book and process an idea that's in that book, but if I'm thinking about it, when I go to kind of like recall, like where did I get that idea? Where was it when I was learning about that? I can actually remember the physical location of where that idea was, like oftentimes like even what side of the page it was on, where in the page it was. But I might have a harder time remembering what the title of the book was or the author. But I can remember where I learned it. If I'm listening to a podcast, I oftentimes will listen and go for a walk or something like that. I can remember where I was on my walk and what the idea was that I was listening to, like when I hear that idea. So for yourself, with your process and your work centered around creating visual representations of ideas, is that something you have like discovered about yourself, known about yourself with regards to like, are you a visual like learner or visual? Yeah. How does that work for you with your memory and with your learning processes?
Yeah. So first, what you were describing about listening to a podcast while being out and about, I've had like several times distinct memories of, one day I might be walking around Portland listening to a podcast, which I do a lot of. Like I walked here today. That's my favorite way to get around the city. Part of the reason I like Portland so much. And multiple times I've done that, had listened to a podcast, been excited about the ideas. And then maybe later that week, a week later, I would be maybe running along that same area or walking in that same area again. And without even meaning to, like the part in the story that I was listening to in that podcast, like came up just because it was triggered like by the environment, not by anything else. So to be like walking through that space again and then remembering specifically what I was listening to when I was in that space is an interesting thing that just happens naturally in those cases. And I feel like the connection there to what I teach, visual note taking, is just being intentional about creating those types of triggers in your brain more intentionally, kind of more deeply, so that when you're, reading a book and maybe there's a particular chapter that stands out and you want to remember some of the key points of that chapter or the overarching framework of the book or just that chapter, maybe taking the time to synthesize that information down into a diagram that you created or like a quick scene that you sketch out with a few words alongside it. I feel like that is you doing that little bit of extra work, that bit of processing power, to then you have this visual that you created. You took the information that at first was just kind of coming in, and you've created something new with it. And that creation process is what will help you remember that. Even if you don't look at that again, that information is going to be more in your brain than it would have been if you didn't create that. But then you also have that reference as you're flipping back through your notebook a year later. You have that as a reminder of what the ideas within that book or that podcast are. So that was my motivation before I even started teaching sketchnoting. When I first just started developing the skills, was because I found that I was, I would read a book that I was really enjoying. And, for the first month after reading that book, I could remember it and I could kind of like talk about it and share some of the main points. But 3 months later or 6 months later, I would remember the title and maybe like the gist of it, but so many of those details were gone. So I wanted something to do kind of in conjunction with the books that I was reading or the podcasts that I was listening to, just to help those ideas stick a little bit more. And for me, the side benefit, I wasn't much of a doodler growing up, not past like second or third grade, but had kind of wanted to develop some sort of a creative skill. So coming across this idea of graphic recording, of visual note taking, it seemed like a perfect intersection of being able to remember more from the books that I read and podcasts that I listened to, and develop this more creative skill that seemed like it would be useful at some point in the future. So that's what made it fun to dive in.
That's really interesting to think about that, because I remember it's been a couple of years now, but I took a speed reading class, and in the speed reading class, like, we definitely learned about various techniques oriented around trying to read faster. But one of the big focuses of the course was also to learn how to be able to still process, like what you just read, because it's great if you can read 200-300 words a minute, which is like a really fast speed. But it doesn't matter if you can't remember it.
Right.
And so a lot of the class was oriented around different techniques to then, like, after you read a chapter, try to see what you process and how you processed it. But we never touched on graphic or visual note taking, I should say. And now that I think about it, I think that for myself, for my learning style, because I think everybody has a uniquely individual way that they learn, I think that it would work very well for somebody like myself. And so I wanted to kind of also give a couple more details about you, because I want to talk about the, with the courses that you offer for your students, you've started to embark upon some pretty interesting applications of visual note taking, including learning a language through visual note taking. And so I definitely want to talk about how you came across that. But as an educator, before you kind of embarked on visual note taking and then teaching others about visual note taking, you were following a more traditional path with education, and you have your master's degree in education, and you were teaching math for junior and high school students. Is that correct?
Yep.
Like, what was that about?
Yeah. So, that was the first, that was my kind of career trajectory for a while. After getting a master's in teaching, I had a quick, I had a lot of years where I kind of like bounced around for a little bit. So like after undergrad, even like the last 2 years of undergrad is when I feel like I began the bouncing around process that only recently I feel like I've settled into a little bit of a sweet spot, hopefully, and excited to keep going from here. But my junior year, I studied abroad in Ecuador, which was an amazing experience. That's part of where the language learning stuff will come back in. Senior year, came back, and my kind of primary major in college was physics. But I had such a blast in South America, and I loved language development that I kind of had to decide, okay, after undergrad, do I want to go into physics? Do I want to do something with language learning? Ended up going the physics route right away. Entered a PhD program in Boston, went to Boston for a year, quickly realized that was not the right fit for me, did not want to spend 7 years on that path. Even though what I liked about the idea of getting a physics PhD and then becoming a professor is the combo that you get with that of being able to teach, which by that point I knew that I enjoyed the world of education and teaching. You could teach, but you could still do research. And that combo appealed to me quite a bit. But didn't work out. Wasn't, within that first year, I kind of realized that didn't quite fit. Ended up dropping out of that program, moved back to Oregon. That's when I started the grad program in teaching. Really enjoyed that. I think I kind of lucked out on the program that I went to. I went to Pacific University, their grad program, but they're a Eugene campus. They have one out in Forest Grove, not too far from us. But a small cohort down in Eugene of middle school and high school teachers getting their degrees together and doing some specializations. So I got certified to teach high school physics, math, and English language learning. Started going down that path. I didn't pursue a job right away, right after that, because I had a pretty intense student teaching experience. So I knew that I had to get my feet wet a little bit, and substitute teaching is a great way to do that. Did that in Eugene for about half a year, then moved up to Portland because that's where a lot of my high school and college friends had kind of made their way up here, kept substitute teaching up here. But kind of realized that a full-time high school teaching gig didn't feel like the right thing for me to jump into, for a variety of reasons. Some of the things that aren't great about the way that school systems work. Also, just my personality being as much of an introvert as I am, how much there's to overcome to step in front of 100, 150 students a day and bring that energy with that regularity and consistency is such a hard job. And which is why all of our teachers should be much better compensated for the work that they do. So again, not quite the right fit. And it was at that point that I started looking for some other creative skill to develop. Speaking of visual memories, I distinctly remember the coffee shop I was in and where I was sitting when I stumbled upon a TED Talk by Sonny Brown called Doodlers Unite that opened me up to this world of sketchnoting and graphic recording. And it's because of her TED Talk that I kind of went down that rabbit hole and decided, okay, I'm going to start a blog about this skill as I try to develop it and just share what I'm learning. And that's what started me down this path and eventually brought education back in and started teaching that online once I felt pretty good about my own skills there. So it's a rough outline of the trajectory.
That's great to know, because I didn't know that you were pursuing at one point also a physics oriented career, or I guess teaching in more of a university setting is likely where that would have led if you were doing research projects as well. But I find that the theme around knowing that you wanted to teach is really interesting, especially because you've continued to just do that, but find your ideal classroom. And it's interesting because in a high school setting, the students are there. They have to be there. But with the way that you teach now, where your students interact with you through the internet, they're there, but they have to find you, come to you, and decide to stay with you. And they've done that. You've got a YouTube channel with was it over 50,000 subscribers now?
Almost. Getting close to, I'm at just about 49,000. But
so you've got 49,000 people that have said, Doug, I will listen to you. I will learn from you. I want to see what information you're continuing to share. So you've got, you know, you've got well over 1 million, I'm sure, cumulative views. So it's crazy to think about that, like 1 million people, or I don't know what your numbers actually are, because you've got several videos that have got, you know, in the tens of thousands of views. So it's really interesting to think that what a classroom like that would look like in real life. So I love it. I love that you continue to find your way to teach and to share information, and information that you're really interested in. And Doug, why were you watching TED Talks? What is it about TED Talks that you enjoy?
Yeah. Wow. So, so much. There's a lot of good things. I feel like when I came across that TED Talk, I think it was at the time, I don't know how long they had been like posting things, where they were on kind of the arc of their meteoric rise in terms of their like impact on culture globally. So, I mean, they must have already been kind of on their way up that for me to have been watching their, you know, their videos. But at some point, it was just a thing that I would watch in coffee shops after substitute teaching gigs frequently, just to follow things that were interesting. And at first, I think just to pay attention to interesting ideas by folks who had, you know, devoted their careers to a particular field and had good stories to tell, a lot of expertise to draw from. And then I think at that time, the time that I watched this one, Sonny Brown's TED Talk, I think I was specifically looking for like, what do I want to do next, right? Like what path do I want to start down, or what new thing do I want to start exploring? So I was kind of actively looking for something to dive into next. So I think I was kind of primed for that video to come my way when it did.
And you were looking, like you were substitute teaching. You started to feel that it wasn't quite right. Is that fair to say, that you knew that you weren't going to be doing that in the future, teaching at a traditional public school institution? Yeah.
So two experiences that stood out. One, I mentioned my student teaching experience was pretty rough. And then what kind of made me fairly certain that wasn't the best path for me. Once I'd been substitute teaching for a while here in the Portland area, got to know some teachers well, what kind of became a somewhat regular sub at a few schools. And because of that, ended up doing a long-term sub gig for a math teacher that was going on paternity leave. So I essentially like got my own classroom for 6 or 7 weeks, I think. So that was kind of like the second test after I've had a bit of experience substitute teaching, getting more or less comfortable in that environment. And it went generally well, but I could see the way that wore me down, like mentally, emotionally, physically. And part of it was potentially like boundary setting, that I was maybe trying to do too much with that experience. Like I really enjoy creating educational experiences. So I think there are times when I maybe took on more than I should have, where I feel like the first handful of years of teaching is largely about just like surviving. Once you get through those years, then you've got the experience, you've developed some lesson plans, your approach to teaching. But teacher burnout within those first few years is very real. And a lot of folks do like stick it out and make it to the other side of that. But I didn't know if I wanted to stick it out to overcome that. I wasn't sure what it would take for me to get to that point. So kind of like, my body and my mind and everything was telling me that wasn't like the space for me, as much as I enjoy the world of education and want to support public education, wasn't the fit for me. And I remember specifically when I started developing sketchnoting as a skill, my first idea of how that might work into a kind of career plan is like thinking that, okay, let me develop some skills so that I have something going on my own, so that instead of doing a full-time teaching gig, I can do like a half-time gig. I can work 0.5 at a high school, because I feel like I could handle that and then have my own thing on the side to make up for the other piece of it.
And is that what you were doing?
No, I didn't. In some ways I kind of did that because I kept substitute teaching for a while.
Got to keep the lights on.
Yeah, at that point I was substitute teaching literally, to pay the bills, while intentionally building my creative skills and the work that I was doing online, and slowly starting to make some money off of that. But yeah, at that point I kind of knew that I didn't want to go full time into teaching, and was kind of just waiting to make the leap over to doing my own thing full time.
And was it a leap, or I mean, like, don't you just get like 50,000 subscribers overnight, and don't students just enroll in your courses right away? Is that the way that it happens for online entrepreneurship or online education?
You spend about, a week building a course, a week building an audience, and then by week 3 you're like set for life.
Oh damn,
that's
it's
about
a
how it
3-week
works.
plan?
It's
I was hoping it was
plan.
more like a 1 week.
Yeah.
So for anybody who doesn't sense sarcasm in the tone of our voices, like we're making a joke of it, but what is it actually like to become a trusted like voice and a trusted educator online, and to actually make it work as someone who teaches students online through your online educational materials?
I think it is something that takes time. There are a lot of different ways to go about it, so obviously I can only kind of speak to my own experience, but I find it very interesting. I find that question very interesting, and generally the broader topic of ways in which folks can build careers with their creative skills, using the internet as a tool to do that, and as a tool to connect with people. And I think that connection piece obviously has to be there. You have to, want to be helping the people that you're making videos for, or making podcasts for, or writing blog posts for. Regular effort and a lot of patience, I think, goes a long way. I feel like a lot of what I've done over the past 6 years or so, it's always hard for me to pinpoint exactly when, but about that amount of time, a lot of what I've done, I feel like, is figure out some of the systems and the routines that work for me to be able to make things regularly, and do that work that I hope is of help to other people, the patience to not expect anything to happen overnight. And I feel like I'm trailing off, so I'll let you redirect from there.
I think that's really important to talk about, because there's one word that you used more than once, and it's something that I'm trying to incorporate with this project, the podcast project, for right now, and also for more, I would say, like marketing-oriented projects that are targeted more towards my video production business, Story Firm. And then also a little bit around my freelance work as a filmmaker, because those are kind of the two splits for myself as far as my career goes. I freelance as a director of photography in film production, but then I also have my own video production company that gets hired out to do maybe the video for an event, live broadcast for an event. Maybe we do the entire commercial, and I bring on a team of people to accomplish that. And with what I was wanting to get at was to do things regularly, because you have, like you mentioned, a blog, you have your YouTube channel, and you also have your podcast and other projects that I've seen you take on in the past. You've always been really consistent about when you're doing a project, when you're releasing information, you have a regular schedule that you kind of like adhere to. And that's really hard for a lot of people to stick to, myself included, because sometimes when you're not seeing the results that you expect right away, it's easy to use that as an excuse to stop doing it. And I think there's a lot that can be missed because you learn, or I've been learning a lot with this project and with other projects, where the things that I learn, I wouldn't expect that I would learn them until I did learn them through making mistakes or through small wins that kind of come across that give clues as to what could work. What are your strategies for keeping things regular with like the projects that you take on with continuously, consistently posting or creating content?
Right. So I feel like the way that I approach any project that I might take on, starting with verbal to visual, that's the name of the place where I teach these sketchnoting skills.
Your online classroom?
Yeah.
Your
And I
university?
actually used to have before. Right now, everything lives at verbaltovisual.com. But when I was first getting it going, I started it there. But then the first home of all of the courses, I also bought verbaltovisualclassroom.com because it was really nice to think of it like I'm building a classroom here. Like I'm not building digital products, even though I am. Like imagining it as my own classroom was a nice way to think about it. So that's where I built courses, and eventually I realized how silly it was to not only have two different domains for people that have to go to, but also verbaltovisualclassroom.com is a very long URL. Verbaltovisual.com is much better. So let's have everything live there.
Cool.
So I brought it all under that umbrella, but with verbaltovisual.com and any new thing that I might start in the future, like the podcast was a new thing that I started at the beginning of this year. I really like weekly output as a container for the regular creation.
It's a great goal.
Regular creation of something, and the thing that you create on a weekly basis, it doesn't have to be something huge, right? And this is where I think you can tailor it to your own circumstances, your own situation, and literally break it down. If you want to put out a podcast every Thursday, what do you need to do on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday to be able to do that? And do you have the time set aside to do that? And if it's too much, if there's no buffer there, you're going to set yourself up for burnout. Like that's what I've learned from substitute teaching and long-term teaching gigs and projects that I've done on my own that I haven't had enough of a time buffer for. So literally breaking it down, and it takes experimentation to do that, right? You're not going to know right away, which is why you just got to jump in and try it and see how it goes. But I think eventually you will figure out where that sweet spot might be of, okay, what is a reasonable thing that I can make and share on a weekly basis? And then how do I structure the work in the days prior to the day I want to publish it to be able to put it out in a way that gives you enough time to work on the thing, but not too much time. Because you do want that like facilitative anxiety to bring in like a word from education, like to push you to overcome the resistance that's going to be inevitable.
Did you say facilitated anxiety?
Facilitative anxiety.
Facilitative.
Yeah. So it's like there's a sweet spot of anxiety that like is enough to push you, but not so much to just totally like paralyze you.
Nervous breakdown. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of where you want to live.
In the facilitative anxiety zone.
Yeah. I think another similar term is like
eustress was one I've heard.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
I was thinking like comfort zone, like stretch zone, and like danger zone, maybe. Like you're outside of your comfort zone, but you're not in the danger zone to where you're going to do like your body or your mind serious damage. So yeah. And then what I also like about regular weekly output is that it takes the pressure off of any individual thing that you make. So within the context of verbal to visual, I, for the most part, make a new video tutorial that I put up on YouTube and Facebook, put out there publicly. Every week is the goal, and I mostly stick to that. But if any one of those videos is bad or doesn't do well, it's not going to hurt the overall business. It's not going to hurt my pride, because even if the thing turns out poorly in my eyes, kind of no matter how well it's received, I always have an opportunity the next week to make the next thing a little bit better. And I think without that, that's also kind of part of my cause of my distress in the world of teaching, even though there's kind of that, in that there's always tomorrow if like things don't go well in class. Certain things feel like too much of a high pressure situation where I don't want to put so much stress on myself for a specific individual thing. I just like being able to iterate. Yeah. And we've mentioned like Michelle Jones was your last guest, and thinking about her giving her TEDx talk, that's the type of thing that like, it's hard for me to imagine trying to do that type of thing if I wasn't doing like regular speaking gigs leading up to it or something like that. You know, like how much of a one shot, even though in that case, it's also not one shot for like Michelle to share her message or get the word out about wayfinding. But always having something that you can keep coming back to, and having the output be a mechanism for you to continue building your skills. You mentioned that's part of the reason you started this show before we were recording. I think you just wanted to like develop your interview skills, your speaking skills, and have conversations with people. So that's how I like to look at the output piece as a skill building piece, and as a slow audience growth piece, and just as an archive of things that you can look back to.
Couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more because of how much I've learned about not only the processes that need to be in place in order to have things run as I'd hope they run, or close to as I'd hope they'd run, but also how much I learn about myself through every project and every, I guess, piece of creative output, if you'd call it that. Anything that makes it out into the universe, there's always something there to learn. How did you come across or how did you decide on, as far as the output, like once per week? Like where did that come from versus like 2 times per week or once per month?
Right. I think it was a combination of one, it being the norm at the time that I was getting into, building a career online, that like in a lot of ways I feel like weekly was a minimum in terms of trying to build an online business. And I feel like it was kind of the norm in the world of podcasting. Video, maybe there's enough variation that it could go kind of anywhere from there. But I think weekly is a sweet spot where it's frequent enough that people can come to build it into their routines, which is why consistency can be so helpful. Like if you get to the point where you're posting videos or posting podcasts every Thursday, the folks who find your show and like it and want to keep watching or listening, they're going to come to know on Thursdays there's probably going to be a new episode. And that's a nice way to be able to build a relationship with an audience over time, in a way that monthly it doesn't like build in that same way. And like daily or twice a week is in some ways is almost too much for some people, I feel like, to be able to truly kind of follow along, depending on the size of the thing and how much attention or investment it requires. So yeah, I just felt like, not too short, not too long. And I also like kind of connected to publishing a new video tutorial with Verbal to Visual. I have a email newsletter that goes out each week. And I feel like that's also where there's some room for a buffer, just in terms of sometimes I'm starting to experiment with still having video be the main way in which I make and share creative work for verbal to visual. It's fun to like dive into a particular thing related to sketchnoting, explore that thing in a video and put that out. It's kind of just like mini tutorials. I'm also trying to get back to kind of the roots of my development of sketchnoting skills at the blog that preceded preceded verbal to visual. That was called thegraphicrecorder.com, where I was just sharing my own sketchnotes of other people's talks and podcasts and books and things like that.
Is that now more on your Instagram?
That Instagram is kind of the home. The way I think of it is like YouTube is where YouTube and Facebook is where verbal to visual videos live. But I still make a blog post around them that lives at verbaltovisual.com. So like it's all on verbaltovisual.com, but the videos themselves live on YouTube and Facebook. Instagram is becoming the home for where the visuals, the sketchnotes live. So I do post them there, but then I also I'm starting to do more of creating blog posts connected to those sketch notes because I enjoy doing the reflective piece of like writing about the ideas in those sketch notes and how I'm applying those ideas to my life. And, I feel like that's just another layer to the creative process to get the most out of those sketch notes personally and selfishly is to do some writing around them.
So that's so interesting because of the way that everything is in some way intertwined. Because you're an avid reader, you're an avid consumer of information through podcasts as well, and also through podcasts and also other video content. And you practice what you preach, which is now I'm just kind of like putting it all together because it's still, correct me if I'm misspeaking, but visual note taking is still a way that you learn and better remember and better process the information that you're taking in and wanting to kind of like put in action. Is that all kind of like correct to say?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And for me, that specifically, that was a kind of a determining factor for going all in on verbal to visual and like deciding to build like my career around this skill is because it's a skill that you can apply to any endeavor, any interest, any career path, any future project that I might want to take on. Sketchnoting is a skill that can follow me. And as I'm digging into whatever topic I want to dig into next, I can use verbal to visual as a place to not only share what I'm learning about that topic that I'm digging into by sharing sketch notes of related podcasts or books. I'm also always putting my sketchnoting skills to use, which then can lead into the way I'm teaching sketchnoting at verbal to visual. So I like that combo of continuing to experiment with sketchnoting in new ways, learning new things with sketchnoting,
such as
and teaching.
Like, what are some of those new things that you're learning through sketchnoting?
Yeah.
So I feel like language learning, that's kind of like this big one that I found very interesting. Like you're learning language, or you're improving your language skills through foreign language skills through sketchnoting.
Yeah.
And then you're also teaching foreign language. Can you kind of talk about foreign language and sketchnoting?
For sure. One of the most recent courses that I built for verbal to visual, it's kind of been fun, just generally the course building model that I followed. The first course that I made was just an introductory course, like introduction to visual note taking. Here's a great way to get started, build some foundational skills, bring together these skills into your own note taking process. That's kind of the goal of the intro course, is just to help people find their sweet spot, a process that works well for them in whatever context they find themselves in. But from there, to be able to dig into specific applications has been pretty fun. So I made a course for teachers, since I still feel connected to the world of education. It was fun to build a set of resources with middle school and high school teachers in mind, hoping that, okay, I'm gonna provide teachers with some materials about sketchnoting that, if they like them, they can use these. They can play my videos in their classroom about visual note taking, and then teach whatever they're teaching that day with that kind of little 5 minutes of visual note taking primer that came right before it, just to weave visual note taking into their classrooms, because that's a pretty large audience of folks that become interested in sketchnoting, in addition to like professionals who just want to use it at work, teachers who want to use it in their classroom and share with their students that this skill exists. It's a thing for folks that consider themselves visual learners. They can share that with their students. So like going into the world of middle school, high school education was fun. And then I've always been interested in language learning. So that was another fun, specific application to look into and just explore how can you use the skills of visual note taking to learn a new language. That's the whole idea behind that course, which I think the two go really well together because of how visual we are. I mean, this is why visual note taking works no matter what field you apply it to. How much of your brain is dedicated to the processing of visual information over any other sense. And what I like about language learning is trying to get to the point where every time you learn a new word, you don't have to go through this 3-step process where you like think about the word in your native language, translate that, think about the translation from your native to the foreign language, and then be able to say the thing or express the thing. But instead develop a direct link between the word camera, or a direct link between the concept of camera and the word in the language that you're learning. So it's like the merger of the visual thing that you're trying to learn the word for with the word itself that sketchnoting lends itself to, right?
What is an example of that? So you worked with it with visual note taking and sketchnoting and Spanish. Is that correct?
I did some. So I learned Spanish before I got into the world of sketchnoting. So as I was building this new course, learn a new language with Sketchnotes, I was starting to learn French because I wanted a new language to kind of apply the activities and the skills that I was developing for that course. So even something as simple as like sitting on my front porch, sketching out the scene from my front porch. Like we got a fence, we got some like rocks and flowers and the street and the sign below, like sketching out that scene, but then just labeling all of those, looking up the word and then labeling that scene with the French words for it, just to have that as a learning tool. And some of it comes down to as simple as like, okay, you're developing like flashcards for the language that you're learning, but instead of just having the word in English and the word in French, it's a thing you sketched out, the representation of that actual thing and the word in French, so that you don't have to go through your native language, and instead you're kind of making that direct link to the foreign language.
I find that really interesting. With visual learning, with visual learning and people who then, I guess, identify as more dominantly like a visual learner, are there any commonalities that you've come across, or is there themes that people share around how they discovered that visual learning was the best means for them to learn? Like, how would somebody know if visual learning or visual note taking is like right for them? Have you thought about that?
That's a good question. Yeah. And I think there are a couple categories. I think two primary categories from what I hear when I'm maybe like someone first comes across my work and sends me an email about it, or how they're excited to have stumbled upon this thing of sketchnoting. I'd say one category are the folks that were like doodlers growing up and always had things going on like the side of the page, but maybe were scolded by their teacher for that, which is unfortunate because I feel like there is this, at least in my education, there was definitely this period of time right around like second, third, fourth grade where you stop drawing completely and the development of verbal skills becomes the primary and almost like exclusive focus. So the folks that were the doodlers get that kind of trained out of them, but they still might consider themselves to be a doodler, and maybe they will continue to doodle their notes, or maybe once they get to college and there's not so much looking over the shoulder, maybe that's what their notes look like in college. So that's kind of like the folks who would self-select as doodlers and as visual learners, even though they might not use that term. So that's kind of one category, folks that have recognized that for a while now. And then the second category is where I would fall in, I think, as folks who are maybe still just as tied to the verbal processing and enjoy the verbal processing. They see the potential of merging that verbal like with the visual.
When you say verbal processing, does that mean through material that they read or through material that they listen to as their initial exposure to that information? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I would say folks who would read a thing or listen to a thing and then a week later be able to recall verbally like some of the key phrases or key ideas or things like that. Like if phrases stick out at you and you're good at, remembering those pieces, then that would be something more along the lines of a strength in that area. But I think it's when you can complement that with things like diagrams or some hand sketch scenes and things like that that can make for a powerful connection. Yeah. I'm not sure how well I explained that, but
yeah, I think that makes sense to me because again, it's about how someone is able to, I don't know if like internalize would be the word, but to take information that they've come across and then be able to find a way to utilize that information, whether that's like keeping it stored for a just in case scenario, like, oh my God, like I remembered that if I come across a bear in the woods, what am I supposed to do? I read it in a book. Damn it, I totally forget. It's like, oh wait, I'm supposed to like make a lot of noise and pretend like I'm really tall. I don't know if that's actually what you're supposed to do if you come across a bear in the woods. Like, don't take this as advice of what you're supposed to do. But the point I'm trying to get at is finding a way to, take information, retain information effectively, to be able to use it effectively in the future if you so decide to.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting because like in high school, like I always like would read. I'm still not really like that fast of a reader. Speed reading class didn't really work for me, but I would create like condensed outlines and it would take a really long time. But when I made my own outline, it was so much more effective for me as a tool to remember and internalize that information versus taking somebody else's outline. So I imagine like with visual note taking, it's got to be similar to like the idea that if I come across your visual notes, like I might not totally understand like what they were representing or the information they were trying to process. But if I made them on my own, even though very likely other people wouldn't be able to tell like what my characters or visual notes represent, I still would be able to look at them and remember why I decided to draw them the way that they did.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really key point to it is the fact that you as the learner are you're the one doing the creation of this thing. You're creating this artifact of what you had learned. And it doesn't matter that like someone else who sees that wouldn't be able to understand it or decipher it. The fact that you would, and that you went through the mental processing and then the actual mark making too, like literally just writing these things out on a piece of paper. That is the type of active learning that helps you remember a thing. They've even done there at some point. I think it would be fun to compile, and I think I've seen these folks have done some of this already, but compile some of the research that's related to learning, and specifically sketchnoting and visual note taking, because there have been some interesting studies that have been done. One of which I remember is that just generally comparing taking notes on a laptop computer versus writing notes by hand, that writing notes by hand is better because if you do it on a laptop, you're much more likely to try to just transcribe everything, and you're not actually doing any active processing. You're just trying to listen and write down everything that's being said. Compared to folks who are taking notes by hand, you can't do that. You can't keep up. So you have to listen for what's the most important thing from the last 5 minutes, and how, so that's kind of like the first stage of this like filtering that occurs. And I think what I find enjoyable about sketchnoting is that it's not just what within the last 5 minutes is worth a sentence or a short paragraph, but then how does the last 5 minutes connect to what was said an hour ago, and how might I be able to connect those things with a diagram or a sketch? That's the kind of like next layer that I think sketchnoting provides, compared to something just like a bulleted list. But literally a bulleted, like handwritten bulleted list is not a bad place to start. That's how I still start with some of the stuff that I do. Just that kind of filtering process that you first do, and then you get to decide, okay, how can I bring all this stuff together in an interesting and memorable way? That's kind of how I think of it.
It's really interesting because it brings up two thoughts that I wanted to kind of dig into, and maybe we'll get to this one second, because I wanted to ask you, like, because you've been sketchnoting now for a little over like 6 years or so, or sketchnoting has been the core of your career for around 6 years, and I want to know how you feel about some of the first sketchnotes that you did. How does that make you feel? But analog, if we would call it that, because like you were just talking about notebook, I've got one right here and I love it. I love, if I'm ever meeting with someone, it's always pen and paper. And sketchnoting, the way that you do it, is also predominantly paper and marker, right? You love your markers?
I love the markers for when I'm making videos for other people. For myself, I love pen and paper also. Paper. Yeah.
So why is it that have you always just kind of gravitated towards more like paper and either marker and pen versus an iPad or something else digital?
Yeah, I've done some experimenting with both. I'm more interested in feel a stronger connection to the pen and paper world because there's because of the simplicity of the tool, and how like there's fewer moving parts. There are benefits to using something like an iPad because of the additional moving parts. Like what's cool about using an app, the one that I'm most familiar with is an app called Procreate that I think is kind of like an illustration tool first. It's not really built as a note-taking tool. There are plenty of note-taking tools that allow you to draw. But I think when I was exploring, like Procreate was a good place to start. But so what you can do with a tablet is that you have as many colors as you want on hand. That's one of the subcategory of skills and tools that you can bring into visual note taking is instead of just a black pen, maybe you've got a black, a red, and a blue, and you can use those intentionally to help structure the ideas on the page. And as part of that filtering and synthesizing process, decide, okay, not only what am I going to capture, but let me give my black marker a specific purpose, my blue marker a different specific purpose, and a red one something else, right? And then that just kind of helps you flow through. With a tablet, you have whatever number of colors you want on hand. You also can move ideas around. You can okay, let me pick this portion, and even though I drew it first over here, now that we're 30 minutes later in the conversation, I actually want to put it over here instead. And you can use layers. So within these, in this case, illustration app, you can turn layers on and off in case you want to maybe do a pencil sketch on one layer that you then hide, or just having things that live on a different layer within the digital tool that you can then manipulate. Sometimes that can be helpful, the ability to erase. So there's all these tools that do have helpful applications that can be woven into the note-taking process. But the thing that I haven't spent the time doing is learning how to use all of those quick enough so that they are actually an aid to the note-taking process as opposed to a barrier to getting things down. So that's why I tend to prefer pen and paper for specifically what I do. But the digital tools are powerful, and particularly with the Apple Pencil, they're getting closer and closer to the feel of writing with pen and paper. But so far, at least, not close enough for most of the things that I do.
I couldn't agree with you more about like sometimes the more simple the tool is, the more effective it is, because it's one less barrier to you getting going with it. Because like, oh, okay, I'm headed off to the coffee shop. All right, I've got my iPad. Oh, do I have my iPad charger? Oh wait, I have the cable, but I don't have the plug. Okay, let me get that plug adapter. Damn it, where's the pencil? I can't find the pencil. Versus like you pick up a pen and you pick up a piece of paper and you're like, all right, I got it. Or if you forget your pen and paper, you go to the coffee shop, you can ask them for a piece of like receipt paper and a pen. They got it. You know, you're set. It's tricky. Technology is enabling, but then it's also sometimes problematic. As I know very well. I find too that in some ways, just the simple aspect of screen time too is a thing. For me at least, like, because I have specific purposes for the iPad and Procreate. It's what I often use for some of like my featured images for a blog post, or mention the podcast. For each podcast episode, I do a little bit of like a title sketch. And I really enjoy all the tools that I just described for creating something that I kind of put into the category of Sketchnote illustration. So it's like not just a Sketchnote. It's somewhere in between, like a Sketchnote and an illustration. But its purpose is to present an idea, or even just, share the title of the latest podcast episode or video or blog post. So I like using it for that, but I noticed that in terms of kind of stamina with a given tool, I get tired of using the iPad if I've been doing it straight for like 45 minutes. I never get tired of like writing on pen and paper and using those tools. So if I'm going to be working with something, if I'm making it my job for, a handful of hours each day, that kind of becomes a factor as well. In terms of like how long of a time you can go working with a particular set of tools. That's also what kind of keeps me in the analog camp primarily. It's so interesting because it's like, you mentioned screen time, and it's something I'm very conscious of with regards to how much screen time I have each day. And with anybody who has an iPhone with the latest like iOS, there's the built into the phone now the utility that tells you exactly how much screen time you spend on each application. And with my work in video, it's interesting because I think oftentimes people would think that like a photographer or filmmaker, they spend most of their time behind the camera, but it's oftentimes maybe 10%, 5% of the total amount of like work that's done for most creatives, professional like filmmakers or photographers, is behind the camera. There's so much more, of course, like time oriented behind the computer, whether it's editing imagery after the fact, communicating with the clients or whoever you're serving with your work, or producing work utilizing the computer. But the nice part is when you are on set, you do have that face-to-face interaction, but again, you can come across the instance where that face-to-face interaction has a screen in front of it, between it, and it's not quite the same as like looking at somebody into their eye versus like looking through a screen into their eye.
Right.
And with even this podcast project, I think the way that I've set it up thus far who knows if it'll stay like this, but every conversation that I've had has always been with the other person sitting across from me. And we were talking about this before we started recording as well, that it's not as common with a lot of podcasts to have those conversations happen in person, because of course it's not easy always to be in the same place at the same time with an individual. But there's something in the air, you know, like when you're with someone, there's little things that are, I think, a lot easier to identify that are happening or not happening,
for sure,
and then overcome.
And it's a more just enjoyable experience too, to like be in a room with someone else and have a conversation, as opposed to as great as the tools of like Skype and phone recorders are to be able to do like podcast conversations. It feels different to be in a room with someone. And I guess I don't know. I'm trying to think of some of my favorite podcasts. A lot of them are in-person podcasts. So I think it does affect the quality. It can affect the quality of the conversation. It's fun to think about. So props for taking the time to like do this as part of your setup and choosing to make this like one of the constraints of what you do.
Thus far. We'll see how it goes though, moving on. But I definitely prefer it. I love getting the opportunity to spend time in person with other people, especially with how solitary the work can be sometimes when you're editing for hours on end, or trying to resolve technical problems if you're working as like a solo entrepreneur or what have you. What I wanted to know was workspaces, because again, like I want to just give a shout out to you for continuing to deliver. Like, you're very consistent. The work that you put out, the educational videos on Verbal to Visual's YouTube channel, and now that you've added in again the podcast, it's a lot to sustain and continue to sustain. And workspaces, you've had some experience with different types of workspaces. What have you found to be kind of strategies for success when deciding on where to create your work?
It's interesting how like simple that question is, but also how complex. And I'm sure it's the type of thing that varies from person to person. And it's something that I've done a lot of experimenting with over the years, trying to find the ideal kind of workspace setup. And I think my current situation is, so far at least, the best fit that I've found. So far, right? And it's always it will change as I learn more about myself. It will change as my like situation grows or changes. But I feel like this would be another interesting thing to spend more time chronicling. This would make for a fun like post about like, here are all the offices that I've worked in and what I learned from each. And the fact that the first like 3 or 4 were my bedroom, like literally the place where I was living at the time, even for a long time with Verbal to Visual, with all the videos that I was making. My recording desk setup was literally right next to my bed. I would set up the cameras at times when I like include kind of talking head portion, so you couldn't see the bed, but it was there. And then like doing some experimentation with renting office space and things like that. I feel like I do need to give you a shout out. We haven't talked about this yet. The first time I ever made a video that now has become like my go-to instructional style, the overhead camera with me sketching out ideas. George, you were the one there setting up the camera, you and Michelle, in a house up in St. John's for the formerly TEDx Concordia U Portland, now TEDx Mount Hood. We did these cool like title slide intros hand sketched for the speakers that year. So in some ways that was my first like office space, was in that house that you came over and set up your tripod. And
for anybody who's just listening, the style that Doug has for the visual note-taking education, it's like camera overhead, really evenly lit, and then you see hand and big like space where the notes are birthed.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of a nice little case study to focus in on, because with that setup, I think for a while, I literally mimicked what I saw you use when I first started doing it myself.
That was a little haggard.
Bought the same type of tripod, bought the same type of camera.
Yeah, we had
literally
some
same setup.
Clamp lights from Home Depot.
Oh yeah, yep, got some of those. And when I went to make a video, I would have to like set all of that up because I didn't have enough space, and there was a lot of setup time for each thing that I recorded. So one of the lessons about workspaces that I've learned over the years is to, again, remove as many barriers to the creation process as possible. So what that looks like now is that I went back to Home Depot, but got like these just metal pipes and did a little like upside down U, drilled them into my desk. And I essentially have the camera and the lights permanently set up. I've got like extension cords, so they're all plugged in. So I can literally like make sure there's space on my memory card, put it in the camera, turn the lights on,
everything's
hit
there.
record. Everything's there. So like as little resistance as possible between like having an idea and making something with that idea. So that's clutch for...
You've made it your own, though. That's I think, important thing too to that I just listened to. You made it totally your own.
Yeah.
I watched the videos where you had the setup where you were in your studio that you were renting, like the office space, where you were building it out there, and you continue to shape it a little bit. You had a different clamp, then you switched to another arm that could articulate a little bit better because you found that was a little bit more effective. So you continue to make it your own.
Totally.
And that's why it works the best for you.
Yeah. And there's always fine tuning that can be done with it. Right.
So you were working first out of your home.
Yeah.
Then where did that go? Then you rented office spaces.
Yeah. I've had, let's see, I guess just 2 different office spaces that I've used. And the whole like living workspace has been interesting things to experiment with, because right before I started renting office space for the first time, the place I had been at, I rented a one-person studio here in Portland on my own, which was kind of like an exciting step. Like I didn't have roommates anymore. I got this small little studio apartment in the part of Portland that I wanted to be in. I thought that would kind of be like a game-changing thing for me. Like I have my own space. This is going to be perfect. My office is still going to be in my home, but it's like, it's more or less big enough for that. And I can make that work. But I found that to be much too isolating of a thing. As an introvert, it was just way too easy for me to like not get out of that space as much as I needed to, as much as I should have. So that's why from there, I did one drastic thing, which was move into a van. We can talk about that if you want. But in addition to moving into a van to be able to do some traveling and try the like location independent thing, I also started renting office space at Wayfinding Academy, the school that our mutual friend Michelle Jones started, because they just had some extra space that they weren't using because the school was just getting off the ground at that point. So that was a good combo. That was definitely a step in the right direction, because there was a community, not to mention an educational community, kind of surrounding my work. So that was a fun, I think of a lot of these things as little experiments. That was a fun experiment to see what it was like to work in that space. Eventually came to realize that for me to have the most freedom to do the type of creating that I want to do, talking about breaking down barriers and resistance, it's really helpful for me to know that when I'm recording a thing, particularly audio, I don't want anyone else to be able to hear me. So even with like other things going on in the school and people walking by the door, even though there's some insulation and, you know, nobody cares what I'm saying in my office space, I still felt that like, people can hear me when I'm recording this and I don't want them to hear me. So that's what led me to moving out of that office space, getting a different one, not too far from where we're recording this, that had a little bit more separation to it, I guess, a little bit more of that helpful isolation to be able to take those creative risks comfortably, I guess. Might seem like an oxymoron to say it that way, but having the space where you feel safe to take creative risks. That's what that piece was about. And just to bring it full circle to where I'm currently at, which has been my favorite situation so far. My girlfriend and I, we live in like a small house that has 2 bedrooms to it, and one of the bedrooms I used as a home office. So I have that space that's separate. It's within the broader living space of a house, but there's a door that I can close. It's not a desk right next to my bed. So there's a much better balance between a separate space, but still incredibly convenient. I love being able to like work from there, particularly for the first half of the day, do my most intense creative work there, and then get out of the house for the second half of the day, go to a coffee shop, go meet up with a friend. That's a key piece to my current work environment and general kind of daily routines, is not spending all of my time in that space, in that home office, but finding ways to do the most important work there and then get out, walk around the city, go to coffee shops, that sort of thing.
And you live in such a, like, way you mentioned, like, your area. I haven't seen your new spot yet, but you live by, I think, one of the most beautiful parks in all of Portland. You said morning time, the first like half of the day, that's when the best work gets done. Has that always been like that? How did you come across knowing that?
I think I've always been a morning person.
Like, what time are you getting up?
6 o'clock. Yeah. So like in bed by 9:30, 10, up at 6. This also works really well for like my partner's schedule too. So that's nice to be able to kind of sync up certain schedules, and I have the flexibility. I love having the flexibility to try to do that kind of syncing up well. And I've always, like, the first few hours of the day have always been the best for me. And now, since I've been a coffee drinker for a while too, like lining it up with that, the sweet spot when you're most caffeinated and doing your most important work then. I enjoy that. Yeah,
I agree. There's something about like the morning time, especially after, like, my girlfriend and I have a dog. There's something about the morning time, like, where I kind of wake up and maybe I'm a little bit still, you know, like getting out of like the dream sleep state. And then my body naturally just starts to kind of like wake up and be more alert and focused and ready to get after it. But then kind of finding that right timing and dose with a little bit of caffeine, I think is a nice combination. Yeah. And now that we've had a dog for a little bit over a month too, there's not been a single day where I haven't been up by at least 6:30, more likely 6 or 5:45, and outside. Yeah. Many times a day. Yeah. That's just the way that it goes with having a dog. Like, the dog doesn't care if it's raining. The dog doesn't care if it's cold. The dog needs to get outside. And if it doesn't get outside, you'll know. Yeah. There will be cleanup involved. Yeah. What have you, so this is interesting because at some point this year, we're probably going to get a dog and likely a cat at the same time. And, you know, at first I was somewhat not averse to having pets because I had pets growing up. I love both dogs and cats. But getting used to having like my own space, my own schedule, this focus time, at first, like having something to take
care of. Like, it's like, I don't want that before we like have to have that or whatever. But then I started thinking about, I'm still sometimes lonely when I work at home. For the most part, I love having that space. And as an introvert, I love, having that time and space to myself. But more and more, I could see the appeal of having a companion in the form of a dog. What have you found within, how long did you say?
It's been about 5 weeks now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Having a dog here in the space.
Yeah. So it's been something I've been thinking about. And one thing I wanted to kind of like address too, it's like, I don't know where I fall in that introvert, ambivert, or extrovert spectrum. I think I'm somewhere like in the middle, because I do like my time alone, but I love my time with other people. And having a dog, like, yes, like you definitely have like a buddy to always like be hanging with if you're somebody who works like from your home. So like my work splits maybe like 70-30 right now, where 70% of the time I'm working from like my home studio, but then the other 30% of the time I'm traveling or out on location for production. And so that's 70% of the time that, say, like I'm home with Uli, our dog. It's great. The interesting thing is, though, it's not that I find myself just hanging with Uli, because it's like I'll be doing my work and he'll be hanging out and stuff like that. But that piece about Uli having his regular schedule with going outside, when you're walking your dog at 6 o'clock in the morning, you're coming across other people who are walking their dogs at 6 in the morning, because that's, I would say, like at least half of the people who are out and about on the streets at 6 in the morning. The other half are maybe joggers or people running. And then there's some other people kind of like sprinkled in there who are, who knows what they've been up to. But you realize like those people with other dogs, they want, for the most of the part, like to have their dog meet your dog. And then you're just talking with those people. You start to see like, oh, like, so-and-so down the street has like their terrier, and their terrier like loves our lab, and like we see each other pretty commonly, like at 6 and then also at 11. And then if we go to the dog park after work, which we do most days of the week, you're also running across like the same people. So it's something that I think somebody who wouldn't have a dog and somebody who's not taking care of their dog wouldn't think about, but you will oftentimes find yourself being more likely to meet strangers and your neighbors. Yeah. Because now you have a real reason to talk to them, because you have to take your dog out. Right. Like with cats, maybe it's different. But although they're in Portland, you have a lot of people with cats on leashes. But yeah, you'll find yourself actually like talking to like more people who you don't know. Yeah. Because you have the dog, and the dog is this perfect conduit for social interaction. Yeah, I feel like that. I recommend it. Yeah, nice. Well, I've gotten to be very excited about that, and I feel like there are a lot of natural parallels too to like parenthood, which I do want to have kids. Like we plan to have kids, and just the way that you were talking about, you get to know like your dog's friends and the parents of your dogs as like a community building thing. Same with like once you've got kids in schools, you get to know your kids' friends and the parents of your kids' friends and all that. And that aspect of having that as a connection point with members of your community is super appealing, because otherwise, like it's easy. You have to be pretty intentional about building those types of relationships, I feel like. Because without something like that, you can go months or years without ever talking to the person that literally lives like 50 feet that way. Yeah, not your neighbors' names. And because you've traveled a bit, and you know it. It's like when you're traveling, especially abroad, I find it seems that like meeting new people is just the daily experience that you're having, and you're always like, going through that moment where maybe you're sitting in a communal like eating area, or you're going to a restaurant, and if you're traveling alone, you especially know the situation where you're like, all right, like I'm gonna ask that person if it's okay if I sit next to them and see what happens, you know?
Yeah.
Because if you don't, like, you're just gonna have another meal, like, maybe by yourself, unless somebody else has that impetus or takes that courage to ask you if it's okay if they share their meal with you. And I don't know, it's just not something I do as much of, or notice people doing as much of, like in Portland or maybe even in the United States. Like, what do you think? Like, is that...
Well, a couple of things are coming to mind.
Yeah.
One, related to Portland, at least. I see these, I guess there aren't too many of them, but some restaurants that you see experimenting with communal seating.
What does that
I don't
look like?
know if that actually lends itself to that much interaction, you know, maybe where you like order your food and pick up your food, and then there's just a bunch of long picnic tables.
Right. I was just thinking so that there's like table style.
And you know what, we had a first beautiful weekend of spring, so there's lots of you know, bars and people eating and drinking out on the patio as well, with picnic tables that are close. But I don't know how much. I feel like even in those situations, people tend to stick with the folks that they came with. There's not a whole lot of like commingling there. The other thing that I was thinking about was a trip that I have coming up, which I'm super excited about. I am taking a cross-country train trip from Portland all the way to New York City.
You like your trains.
I love my trains. This is the longest train trip I've ever gone on, but not the first.
How long does it take by train to get from Portland to New York?
It's almost 4 days. So it's like
it's a little faster than I thought, actually.
3.5 days, I think.
Cool.
And so I'm doing that trip on my own. Like, my partner Shelby's going to be in Spain chaperoning her brother's like high school trip out there. So once she kind of had that booked, I was like, okay, I need to do some sort of an adventure while she's away on that. That's why I decided to do this long train ride, because I'd done similar things before. My
California,
brother,
right?
Yeah, my brother lives in Los Angeles, so I've done the one down the coast. I've got a high school friend that lives in Chicago. That's the farthest I've done to date. And there's just something about the train as an environment for like relaxed but also inspiring creative work. Like, I kind of treat it as my office on wheels for a little bit. Some aspects of those long trips are painful when you get the cheapest ticket available, because you just got your normal seats that are hard to, you know, you don't get very horizontal, so it's really hard to sleep on those. This trip will be the first time that I've ever like splurged for the sleeper car.
Oh, nice.
So hopefully
it's a game changer.
I'll be able to get actual sleep. And what's built into that experience is your your meals are included in the dining car. But it's a tiny little dining car. So whenever you go to like have a meal there, if you're one person or two people, you're going to get seated next to two other people that happen to show up at about the same time. So I'm really curious to see what that will be like. I like that that's there, because I know that, you know, 3 times a day at least, I will have the opportunity to have conversations with people, which will be good for me. Otherwise, my tendency is just to, you know, seclude myself in my little sleeper car and do my work and reading and all that. And then I imagine, you know, you'll get to know some of the folks that are on long stretches, but then there'll also be some like people getting on here, but then off there. So there'll be this like turnover that happens. So I'm looking forward to that, specifically for that opportunity to have that.
Travel's been a part of your, I mean, it's something that you've continued to do for, I mean, pretty much as long as I've known you, because like, yeah, you mentioned, you alluded to also your experience with #vanlife. But also studying abroad in Ecuador, and you've taken international trips since then. Like, what is it about travel? Like, what is the appeal for travel for you? Like, what do you find you get out of it?
Lots of things. I think generally the putting yourself in a different environment is just refreshing and super engaging. One of the podcasts that I listened to recently talked about the kind of restorative power of immersing yourself in natural environments generally, which is why I love being next to Mount Tabor, like we've talked about. But then within the context of that conversation, this woman did a trip to Ireland and just spending time in a new country, walking around that country, provided this, relieved a sense of stagnancy in her life and her work, and provided this momentum that allowed her to kind of move forward with what she was doing. So that's a big appeal, just literally seeing new places and being exposed to new environments that you haven't seen before. And then with that, a different culture. So people that live differently and think differently, do relationships, family, social, all those things differently than we do here. And I think that's a good thing for all of us to experience. So yeah, all of those things make it fun to travel, get someplace new. And I think it's become a thing where I think I start to notice it if like a year has gone by, maybe shorter than that, but definitely on a yearly scale. If like I haven't been to a place that I've never been before, you kind of get this like itch to experience that, because it is a very unique and refreshing experience. So yeah, I feel lucky to have been exposed to that, thanks largely to study abroad, being encouraged at the undergraduate college that I studied. And that year in Ecuador was a big one to kickstart that. And like after that, I've kind of enjoyed it ever since and tried to find opportunities here and there to get out of the country or just visit another state or even just another part of the state of Oregon, which is huge and has so much going on.
You mentioned, so I didn't know actually that your study abroad in Ecuador was for an entire year. Is that something that you think about, or have you discussed with your partner as to whether or not you two might do an extended trip or live somewhere else out of the country in the future?
Yes, in some ways, yeah. So probably not anytime super soon. The one scenario that we've talked about, and I think she knows someone, it might just be a friend of a friend, once their kids were had gone through schooling and were out of the house, they then decided to just spend like 6 months at a time living in a different city. And
across the United States?
I think across the United States, and I think abroad as well. I could be wrong about that, but there's something that's very appealing about that. Like I would love to go live in Chicago for 6 months. Like my partner Shelby lived there, so she knows the city, and that would be cool to see that. Go live in Paris for 6 months, go live in Quito for 6 months, or because there is something that is so much different about spending a long period of time in a place compared to like just a weekend or just 10 days, as transformative as that can be. And we hope, fingers crossed, if resources are there, would love to be able to do that on a fairly regular basis. Those short trips, getting to know a place more intimately takes time. So that's what, we'll see if things pan out to actually be able to do that. Because what that also brings to mind, and hashtag van life was part of this too. Particularly like the relationship that I'm now in, I've started to appreciate roots and realize how meaningful those roots contribute to your life. In some ways, my year of van life, I feel like I was trying to solve some things just by, getting in a van and going on an adventure. And as important and great as adventure is, there's something that's just different about growing relationships, building the type of community that you build when you walk your dogs at 6 a.m. every morning and get to meet the neighbors. So I guess that's kind of a long way of saying that I kind of like the idea of settling down and having a family in one place for a while. But then also if we end up being able to at some point, spend 6 months at a time living in different places. And maybe, who knows, I've got some friends of friends or friends of family members who have done that with kids. They'll go spend a year living abroad somewhere, and that's a pretty great thing to expose your kids to at any age, I think. So that would be fun. Yeah. Do you have any plans within that realm?
I find that interesting. Like my girlfriend and I definitely, we talk about having a family and, taking our relationship, of course, like to the next level. And it's definitely something we are interested in. Like, we've been fortunate to have some international adventures together as well. 2 months in Europe a few years ago, and about a month in Nicaragua. We both really enjoy, learning through being somewhere totally unfamiliar. And I think it also, like, I think she would echo this as well, but feel like all senses are heightened when you're in an unfamiliar place. And I think that is something that's kind of built into our DNA in a way, where we're really lucky to live in the United States of America. And at this present time and place, I don't feel any sense really of imminent threat to our safety. I think that we are really fortunate to be living in what I would consider has got to be one of like the safest times, like in mankind's history, in modern history, that human beings have lived, and how easy it is really, I think, for us to exist here, especially here in Portland. Like, life is good. Every grocery store is well stocked, and there's no issues with meeting our basic needs. But would love to get abroad and have an extended stay, and learn what there is that I wouldn't even expect to learn, because I think that's another thing with traveling. There's so much that you can kind of like carry with you in terms of expectations about a place and the people in that place, but with a little bit of an open mind and a little bit of a taste for the uncertain, you can get a lot out of a trip that you wouldn't expect otherwise, or even know to expect. So we would love to do something like that, but it depends, because of course, like with the type of work that I do, I can carry it or have projects take me abroad and be there for shorter periods of time, or potentially even longer periods of time. But with Lisa's work right now with the city of Portland, it's not quite feasible for her to get away for a few months.
Right.
But maybe she'll have a sabbatical built into her work in the future. I would hope. Speaking of international, Doug, with the work that you do with Verbal to Visual, you have students who come from across the globe. Like, how is that relationship with those students who are in different time zones and maybe native speakers of other languages? What's your experience been like with that?
I think it's one of the fun, cool, interesting aspects of doing work online, is that there aren't boundaries to who might find your work and who might want to take part in it in some way or another. And at various times with Verbal to Visual, there's been webinar components to it. Not currently, but there was a period when I would host these weekly webinars, same time, same place, each week. And it was in those when it was particularly fun to see folks come together from around the globe. 'Cause like, for me, I tended to host them at about like 12 p.m. Pacific time. But then you got some people like on the East Coast here, it's like 3 p.m. Some people like in Australia where it's like 5 or 6 a.m. in the morning. So like in some cases, literally being able to see the differences, if it's like dark outside, light outside, people just getting up, people just getting ready to go to bed. And then obviously to have folks with different native languages and cultural experiences, particularly when we're coming together to develop and use these visual skills. Sometimes, I don't know if I'll be able to remember an example, but sometimes some of the symbols that you use have specific cultural meanings, or, if we do an activity where I draw one thing and like, okay, what would this represent to you? People have different takes on it. So just generally having conversations, creating spaces where the folks participating in the conversation don't all come from the same background. That generally, I think it's just such like a valuable thing to have, and was a fun thing to participate in. You come together around this common interest. You're all working to develop the same skill of sketchnoting, but one, you all live in a different part of the world and had a different type of upbringing. So that contributes to how the conversation might unfold. But then also with the case of sketchnoting, people are using it in different ways, like different careers. So that was kind of fun. I feel like there was a good cross-pollination of ideas because of the ways in which people would show up and share what they did the last week with their sketchnoting. And they'd be like, oh, cool, that's awesome that you used it in your presentation about this, or you used it this way in your meeting. I'm going to steal like this part of what you did and try it in my project this week. So that cross-pollination of ideas was probably the highlight. Cross-pollination, and then like, global community is pretty cool to be able to tap into.
Is there any like careers or occupations that people have who came across your work and then became students of sketchnoting that you find interesting? Like you've already mentioned that you've worked with now like teachers who are working more in the traditional education space, whether it's like high school or junior high school, or maybe even younger. You've had people who are kind of like oriented around maybe public speaking. I'm not sure if that was one, because we were talking about conferences, but are there any kind of groups of people, whether it's the type of job that they have or the industry that they're in, where you find that they kind of gravitate towards sketchnoting more?
That's a good question. I guess a couple of the categories that I might have mentioned that come up, definitely educators is like a pretty strong community, like almost sub community within the community of sketchnoting. It's like educators that are using sketchnoting. There's lots of folks that are exploring that space.
So can it be even outside of like school? Can they be like maybe they're athletic trainers or they're filmmakers who are teaching workshops, or anybody who's kind of, I guess, like teaching material to students in a classroom setting?
Yes, in some ways I would probably consider that a different category. The first being like classroom teachers, like middle school, high school teachers that are using these skills in their classroom and sharing ideas with each other, and like writing books about teaching using sketchnoting in a classroom, or like publishing things on their own YouTube channels just for like that setting. I consider that kind of a community. And then I think there's also the world of the type of educators that you described, maybe doing something similar to what I'm doing in terms of maybe teaching on the internet and using videos to do it, or doing in-person workshops, and they just want to use more visual tools, visual aids to present their ideas. That's a pretty strong category. And I feel like I'm sure my perception is a little bit biased because it's influenced by what I see coming in my email inbox, what I see on my Twitter feeds, and like what people are tagging me in on Instagram and things like that. So I'm getting a view of the folks that are most actively sharing what they're doing, which kind of lends itself more towards folks doing some sort of online entrepreneurial thing, which is a fun community to be a part of. So that's another one there as well. And I think part of what that represents too, I haven't done a ton of super in-depth market research into the folks that are making their way into sketchnoting. I don't even know if I want to spend that much time digging deep into those particular weeds, but yeah.
A lot of teachers, it definitely sounds like people who are,
Yeah. And then still that category too of professionals of any field who want to continually be learning new things about their craft and their profession. Because I think part of what's going on here in the broader world of work is that the jobs that are going to stick around are going to be the jobs that require creative skills and different types of learning and decision making and problem solving. So since work is heading in that direction, I think that's what makes taking the time to develop a skill like sketchnoting more appealing, I think, for folks in any career, because it can be this lifelong learning tool that can help them establish their proficiency in their field. And if they're sharing their sketch notes to every conference they go to within their industry, chances are, like the power of visuals and the summaries that they're providing, they can, they become well known because they're sharing what they're learning. So I think that's the appeal for the kind of general creative professional out there.
So really, really interesting. For somebody who doesn't have experience with sketchnoting and they wanted to learn from you, where would they start?
Yeah. Lots of good places. I would say definitely probably the YouTube channel would be a good place. Obviously all of my things live at verbal2visual.com.
And the YouTube channel is also YouTube Verbal to Visual.
Yeah. Just search Verbal to Visual on YouTube. 'Cause I do like making new video tutorials each week. So there's some good stuff there. Yeah.
And then
were you asking like where to point people to, or like,
I don't know. I guess like knowing to go to your YouTube channel would be great. And I know that there's a ton of great like tutorials for like absolute beginners, and even like videos where you explain really like what is sketchnoting. For people who wanted to like dive deeper in a more like guided way, like what does the courses that you have created look like? Like how do those work for students who are interested?
Yeah. So I'll kind of give a description of the first one that I made, and I think more or less followed similar formats with the ones that I've made since then. With that first course, an introduction to visual note taking. Each of the lessons themselves aren't super long. So the way that I try to approach education in my teaching style is to provide a little bit of structure, a little bit of framework around a new thing, but to get as quickly as possible to the student doing something with those skills. So within the intro course, that starts by breaking down sketchnoting into just 4 core skills. Those skills being the use of text, so you're still writing words, it's not just about drawing pictures. Layout being the second one, which has to do with like where on the page you're going to place the next idea, the next thing. Imagery being the third, so developing some basic drawing skills so that you can represent a camera or a glass or a microphone in real simple, not fancy artistic drawings, but a quick sketch. And then the fourth being color, deciding if you want to use a few different colors within your process. So it starts by looking at each of those skills individually, and then also even before that, kind of identifying like why you want to learn this skill, what do you want to do with it, because knowing what you want to do with this skill helps you decide how to approach, like how to weave together those 4 skills that I just outlined into your own note-taking process. Because that's where the course goes to after those core skills. It's like, okay, how do you want to bring together those things? Keeping your context in mind, whether you're in meetings or you're a teacher or you're a student, like getting to the specifics about your situation, so that you can create a process for yourself, similar to the way we've been talking about kind of fine-tuning your office setup and your processes around creating. It is like building those skills and then developing with them a process to actually like get the most out of whatever information you're taking in or whatever information you want to present. And I think to like generalize that to my approach to building courses, it's identifying the skills that are important, helping folks develop those skills by providing some activities, and then helping them build their own process for weaving together those skills. Yeah, I think loosely that's how I kind of do approach those deeper dives.
Is there a general time frame that you've maybe recommended for students, where if they're brand new to visual note taking or they haven't drawn anything since fourth grade art class, like about how long it takes for somebody to get up to speed to become proficient in utilizing sketchnoting as a tool?
Yeah, gosh, that's a good question. I think it varies a lot from person to person. So short answer is I don't know. And I think what I tend to focus on and encourage more than anything like a specific number of hours to learn this skill is just setting aside a dedicated amount of time each day or each week, time and a place to work on this, even if it's literally just like 20 minutes a day or an hour each Saturday. I think that is the most important thing. With that said, it's the type of thing where there's very little barrier, because no matter what you do, you're so regularly exposed to new information or have to learn something new or are working on something that like the opportunities to use your sketchnoting skills, even as you're building them, they will like keep presenting themselves to you. So
because you sketchnote books, you sketchnote podcasts, you sketchnote presentations.
Yeah.
You sketchnote your front porch.
Yeah. Just straight up visual journaling, right? Like that's a nice tool that can be built in. So yeah, I guess it's that a bit of dedicated practice time on a regular basis where you're intentionally building your skills, and then looking for opportunities throughout the rest of your day in life to like try out that thing that you practiced this morning or last weekend. And like, don't be hard on yourself if it doesn't go super well the first time, because like there's opportunity to improve and keep working on
I was going to ask that earlier. How does it make you feel to look at the sketch notes that you created when you were first starting out versus the ones that you're creating now? And the reason I ask is because I think as many like people who work as either photographers or filmmakers can attest to, it can be really challenging for me personally to sometimes look back at work that I created, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago. And it's not always the case, but not feel a little bit of like angst knowing like, oh, this is out in the world representing who I am and what I did. But I've started to try to come to terms and see it as more like, well, it's just out there, and I'm happy to say that now I've created this. Not that that's, the exact scenario that's happening, but how does it make you feel to look at the work that you first created versus what you create now?
Yeah. I think so. There's something working in my favor that's a little bit different, I think, than the situation that you described, in that the first sketchnotes that I created, in my whole first like website where I got comfortable with the concept of blogging and sharing my work and putting it out there, the primary purpose of that work was just for me. Like it was just for me to learn the ideas. And even though I was putting that work out there publicly and knowing that some people might come across it and like it, or find it a valuable, useful visual summary of a thing, before it was for anybody else, it was for me. So when I go back and look at the first sketch notes that I posted on the graphic recorder, it's more my reaction is more centered around the ideas that I sketchnoted and like the affection that I still have for those ideas, and often for the people that they came from. That's what's most kind of like, that's what comes up when I look back at them, as opposed to like critiques of the form itself. And maybe it's also been far enough that it feels like a different person that made those. So maybe there's enough distance for me to not be like judgmental about them. Yeah, but I think that's different than if I were to go back maybe and look at like the first videos where I was starting to teach sketchnoting, because that's when it became more about, it's not just for me. Now I'm intentionally trying to create this thing that's valuable for someone else. That kind of fits more into the category of what you described. And that's where like cringeworthiness or whatever might come into play. Or,
I think that's an important piece of advice to remember, that depending on what you're doing, it's not always just to serve other people purely for them. Like when I get hired to do work, like that is the scenario, but it's still a craft and a use of time that I've decided I wanted to be involved in. And so in the most like basic sense, like it still was for me, like I still decided to do this for myself. And I think it's hard for me sometimes to remember that, but it's a important reminder to have, that I chose this. I decided to be in this scenario now, and it is for me first, and then for other people after that. So it's a nice way to process that feeling.
Yeah. And I feel like part of what's coming up there too is, a lot of the emotional challenges that are connected to doing and sharing creative work regularly. And like, in terms of being able to put out things regularly on like a weekly basis, or however often you're making a thing. I think one of you could call it a soft skill that is important to develop there, is a bit of a separation between yourself, your identity, your sense of worth, and the thing you created. That's probably the hardest like skill to develop, is that sense of separation. But it's important to do that. And maybe, I don't know how close I am to that point, but I think that's something that I'm trying to work toward, where the way I try to approach my work is, and this is influenced by like Stephen Pressfield, The War of Art, and some other like helpful influences along the way. This guy, Jim Collins, his work too has been really helpful. Your role as someone who does creative work is to show up each day, put in the hours, do the best work you can, and put your thing out there. And that's kind of it. Like, the thing that you put out doesn't represent you in its entirety. It's not, it's not the thing that should determine whether like you have trouble sleeping at the end of the night or something. Like, I've been caught up in all these types of situations before, where it's really hard to distance yourself from the work that you do. But I think I'm currently in the process of trying to like retrain my brain to, at the end of the day, and even as I'm going throughout my day, to be intentional about how I choose to like evaluate how that day is going. And within the world of online business, it's really easy to just keep looking at the sales page and like, have I sold anything today? Like, have people liked my work? Have people like retweeted the latest thing that I put out? And associating your mood that day and your sense of worth with those numbers. That's the easiest thing to do and the quickest thing to do, because it's right there. And in terms of like making an income, it's connected to your viability, but getting to the point where it's not those things that I'm checking to feel satisfied about my day. It's like the question of, did I put in the hours that day? Did I put in the work? What was the quality of my attention while doing that work? And if I put in the hours and I like attended to that thing well that day, then being satisfied with that. That's the goal. I would say maybe like I don't know, 45% of the way there, but I found it helpful just to think about it in those terms.
Yeah, it's a good thing to think about, and having it kind of explained in the way that you just did, it makes sense for me to think about logically, and I want that to also make sense when I put it in practice. It's it's something I've been thinking about for a while. With the way that you kind of approach, like you mentioned it, like retraining your brain, and you have, your schedules around when you're going to put out your next video, and how you have a routine around like, that, your morning time is really like a sacred like work time. Are there other practices that you have that are part of your daily, do you have daily practices that also help you with your work and with kind of keeping things on the right side of the...
I do. I have a couple. I think I mentioned two, one that's been around for a while and another one that's newer, both of which have been very impactful. One has been a daily meditation practice. I feel like relatively early on in in the development of my creative career, came across the idea of the importance of like mindfulness and establishing like healthy mental habits. So I feel like that inspiration came at a right time early on, and then was reinforced in various ways. So even just like 10 minutes some days, 20 minutes other days of meditation helps to build the muscle of being aware of your inner dialogue throughout the day, because a lot of this is like connected to inner dialogue. How are you talking to yourself about the work that you're doing in any given moment, or about your life at any given moment, and recognizing that you can turn the volume up on those conversations and direct them away from negative trains of thought and, toward more positive ones. And it's not within the realm of neglecting the like facts in front of you or your current situation, but like finding a more balanced way of kind of interpreting where you're at. So that's been a big one that just helps to build that muscle of recognizing.
And is that
how
meditation before you start anything in the day, or can you do it at any time during the day? Like, what is it actually like for you? Yeah,
for me, I've found that it fits best mid-morning. So after I've done a couple of hours of work, because for me, it takes me some time to like wake up, and I enjoy doing my most important creative work kind of right after I've had breakfast and I'm starting to have coffee. But after I've done a couple hours of work is a nice time for that break to both do some not necessarily processing of that work, but it's kind of a helpful reset for like calming me down after the work that I've done in either direction. Sometimes I'm like super hyped about the work that I just did and like feeling great about it.
And you still do the meditation.
Yeah, I find it helpful then to I guess, get to a more balanced place, because even when you're in that pumped up mode, it can you can start setting expectations for yourself about always being in that pumped up mode, or starting to set the expectation that the piece of work that I just did that I feel really excited about, going to the place of, I can't wait to publish it. People are going to like love it. It's going to like, so many people are going to want to share it, or it's going to play this role in my business. And I think the danger is when you start to associate external results based on the way you feel about the work that you just did. I think that's can be a dangerous place to get to, because no matter how you feel about the work, like, you don't know how people are going to react to it, how useful it will be, the role that it might play in your creative career. And I think it's helpful to not set expectations about how your work will be received. So that's why it's helpful to, balance out that super hyped mode, but to still be like satisfied that you're proud of the work that you just did. It's not to remove that. It's just to kind of bring it to a balanced place, because I think you have to do both that. And if you're feeling in a crappy place about what you just did, it's a nice way to, again, reset and give yourself the opportunity to be like, wait, why am I thinking like that way about my work or myself? Like bringing yourself back up to a quieter mind, or gentler self-talk that can then set you up to what you choose to do after that in the afternoon, and the work that comes from there. So that's loosely my kind of take on meditation, I guess.
If and correct me at any point if I'm misspeaking, but if you're trying to have a project that you're working on, something creative that you're making, and you don't want to set yourself up for disappointment with the result by using expectations as the guide, or the almost like an end goal or series of end goals that you want, what keeps you motivated with those projects if expectations aren't the ultimate goal?
Yeah. So I guess a couple of things. I would consider myself, I don't consider myself to be a perfectionist these days. I think I was a perfectionist, like growing up and throughout my whole kind of formal schooling. And though I'm not a perfectionist, I do care a lot about the quality of the thing that I make. I've gotten comfortable with, I think a lot about, like shooting for 80%, like trying to get the thing that I'm working on to 80% and pushing it out the door. Because of the, I forget the name of the rules, but the amount of effort it would take to get it from 80% up to 100% or even 90% or whatever. It's kind of not necessarily a great return on investment. So I kind of like getting to 80% and pushing it out the door, but I still care about quality and impact of the work that I put out. So it's not that I don't care about how it's received, and it's not that I don't want it to be received well, to be a high quality thing, to be meaningful for other people. It's just that I'm trying to train my brain to not depend on, I guess you could call it like external validation, to say to myself that was a good day. So yeah, it's still there. I still want to, and I guess there's a little bit of I think anybody that chooses to go down something more of like an entrepreneurial path, there's some sort of an inner drive there. There's something pushing you to do that work. And I have that inner drive, and I want to, I like being able to shape and create my career. So there are kind of bigger picture goals and a general direction that I want to take my life that keeps some of that like motivation there.
Do you compare yourself to how you were, like, because I asked you that question because it's something I've been thinking about, and even after I asked you and then you started to kind of explain like the way that you think about it, it came to mind that a friend of mine like advised or helps coach people on thinking also about like when they're reaching for goals and, you know, it's a goal that maybe will take a long time, months, maybe years. It's hard to know when you're going to be successful. But the way to think about it that was talked about by this friend was asking, he advises people to ask themselves the question, am I better than I was yesterday? Like, did I try just a little bit more, or did I do something just a little bit better? Like, am I better than yesterday? And like just using that like as a constant benchmark, because it's like, well, you're going to come across days where like maybe you weren't better than yesterday. Hey, that's the way the cookie crumbled today. You know, maybe you got really sick. Maybe you couldn't get after it as hard as you did the day before, but think about that and try to do better tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, because it's hard, because it's like if you're setting yourself up for the expectations, or when I've set myself up for the expectations of like great success, and I haven't come there to hit that exact expectation, even though I did make progress, I've still carried a bit of disappointment, and maybe I think that's also allowed me to not allowed me to enjoy like a small victory of sorts. Like I'm thinking right now about like pursuing various more like physical goals with like some gymnastics strength training programs I was doing, but I can also think about different goals that I've set for myself with my creative work, with my video businesses, or my video business and my freelance video production. Yeah, so it's definitely not an easy expectations are not easy to totally rid ourselves of.
It's true. And I don't
orient ourselves around.
Yeah. And like part of the reason why I find daily meditation as a key piece to my routine is that like I still find myself in those same places, like reacting to work in a certain way, or like the things that we're describing. I don't think they're ever going to go away. So it's not like, and I guess this is part of like expectation setting. Like, I don't think I'm ever going to get to a point where I am fully detached from the work that I put out there, and I'm not going to care at all about how many people like it versus dislike it on YouTube, or any metric that you choose to pay attention to. I don't think you ever can like fully separate yourself from that. So it's more about like, what are the practices that you're building into your life to help you balance out that potential for expectation, or give you an opportunity to deal with that disappointment in a like healthy way. Can I bring in a Jim Collins one, which was the second one too, which is the meditation is one that kind of I've been experimenting with for a while. But
is there any type of meditation in particular too? But I still want to get to the Jim Collins.
I think, broadly mindfulness meditation. I've wanted to try like transcendental just to like see what it's all about, but it's kind of behind a pretty big like paywall to do the official training.
I was listening to one Sam Harris guided meditation. Like I listened to this exact same 20-minute like guided meditation for like months on end, like every morning, like this exact same thing, and it was great.
Yeah, well, and
it was
I
free.
think. Yeah, that's great. There are so many free guided meditations out there. And I think one that I found particularly helpful, I think I heard of from Tim Ferriss's interview with Maria Popova, who runs Brain Pickings. Like, and this is an example of like one tiny bit of one conversation of a podcast that I listened to having this impact, mentioned Tara Brach, who's done a lot of writing about meditation and has a bunch of, I think she either has her own podcast or there's a bunch of recordings of her guided meditations out there. So that's another person to look out for. And it's free. Yeah. There's lots of, I think there's a app that I used for a while called Insight Timer that has a lot of guided meditations from different teachers, or you can just like do your own self-guided for, 15 minutes or whatever. So those are some good places to, I think.
But I'm sorry, I interrupted. You were going to mention another strategy.
Yeah, I was just worried I was going to forget, because
Good to Great right there.
It's
famous business book.
Yeah, we've been kind of in a heady space for a while, and what I learned from Jim Collins on another Tim Ferriss podcast, this one not too long ago, he described one of the things that he does that I've started doing now for the past almost 2 months, which I really have enjoyed it so far. It's a really simple daily log. What he does, he has like a stopwatch. It sounds like an actual old school stopwatch that anytime he starts doing creative work, he starts that stopwatch going. And while he's focused on that creative work, it just keeps going up. And he does that throughout the day, so that at the end of the day, within this daily log on like a spreadsheet, I'm just using Google Forms for mine, you can record the number of creative hours that you put in that day, which is very different than like 9 to 5 work hours. It's like actual focused hours on creative output. So he tracks that each day. He has like a 1 to 2 sentence description of the work that he did. And then he rates the day from -2 to +2. So just like a 5-point scale of it being a positive day or a negative day or a neutral day. And that by doing that every day for years now, he can look back and see, what was going on all the days that he was at a 2, what was going on all the days that it was a -2, how was that connected to the number of creative hours that he was trying to do and the specific things that he was doing those days. So it's a cool record to compile, but that it's not even that I've been found to be the most beneficial. I don't have a stopwatch. I use my phone. I use the built-in stopwatch on my phone anytime I start to do any bit of creative work, and literally hitting that start button and see that timer go up compared to maybe like saying, I'm going to work for 20 minutes, hit a 20-minute timer and it goes down. That's helpful. But to see the timer go up and to see those numbers go up to hours for a given day, there's something that I have found to be like weirdly motivating and kind of calming, and like, it's like punching the clock for that day. Like, all right, this is the time that I put in, the hours that I'm putting in. I'm going to do work now. And it's that piece. And even if it's only, maybe 2 hours of really focused creative work that day, up to 5 or 6 on a really good day, having that be what I focus on and having that be the thing that I track, I found that to be helpful. So that's one of the very specific things that's helped develop that particular mental habit, I guess. Like, that's where my focus is. I want to get as many good hours a day, but also not too many, because there's like
diminishing returns.
There's diminishing returns on your creative life and on the rest of your life. Because if you try to put too many hours.
Oh man, because I would love to know for those days where you have the 2s, and there is a positive correlation between the amount of time that you spent and that reason for that too. If there was also, tracking around, like you had already mentioned it, that the morning time is your best creative time, but then you still do your work in the afternoon. I would love to know like where the ties in, where those relationships are between, like, was there a specific time of day, or for you, is there anything with the tracking of the quality of the days and anything related to either your work or other practices that you have that you found for yourself? Like, have there been anything that come up? I know 2 months isn't the longest stretch of time to know.
Yeah.
Or is there a magic number for the amount of hours that you like to work per day that you're starting to be like, oh man, like actually like 4 hours is better than 5 usually?
Yeah. I think it's always going to be a range, and it's always going to depend on a variety of circumstances. So I'm trying not to set like any hard rules or not to like be a broken record, but expectations about what makes for a good day or not. Largely because I feel like I'm entering a stage of life where I am like, I don't want to be exclusively concerned about my own well-being, right? I think that's where I was living for since I started doing my own thing until about a year and a half ago.
Thinking as an online entrepreneur, like if that's where your mindset is at.
Yeah. So part of not worrying about only taking care of yourself, but also like being open to the relationships that you're building with other people, a family that you might be starting to build, being able to be flexible in like how I react to things, what I make myself available for each day. That flexibility is really important to me, which is connected to, not being too closely tied to any particular output on a given day. So I think it will always be a range. In some ways I think I want to set a minimum of maybe just an hour a day, maybe 2 hours a day, to make sure that I'm not taking any days off unnecessarily. And mostly I'm thinking Monday through Thursday here, not even Monday through Friday, but giving enough of a push to make some strides in a positive direction so yeah, I don't know about a minimum outside of that. I honestly don't even know about a maximum because it's just so situational. What I'm curious to see is what happens throughout an entire calendar year, because we're getting to this point of the year when Portland is a pretty great place to be, where the days are longer. One of my favorite things about the home I currently live in is the front porch that we have, this outdoor space. That's where I like to hang out in the afternoon. And there's something about being in that space, even at 4 p.m., no matter how much work that I've done up until then, it feels so good to be out in that outdoor space. And I'll spend some time reading a book, but oftentimes when I'm in that type of a situation, it's almost inevitable that ideas are going to crop up and I'm going to want to reach for my notebook to start writing the next thing. And if I do dive into a little bit of writing or creative work in those hours, that would be something that I would want to start my stopwatch for to keep it going up. So I think that there's the potential environmentally for it to change depending on the seasons and general energy levels. And even, I don't know what happens when you first have a kid. It's going to go down. I'm totally cool with it going down, because I want to be there to obviously help raise my kid and be able to adjust to circumstances. So this is probably just all way too long-winded of a way of saying that it's very determined by circumstances. But I do think that insights are inevitable. You're bound to see patterns by keeping this type of log, I think, whether it's connected to the seasons, whether it's connected to the type of work projects that you're taking on or the other things going on in your life. So I think it's a pretty cool tool for having insights into your own work style and
Yeah. I listened to that episode as well, and I remember Jim had a specific number that he wanted to hit, and I don't know what that was, whether it was 100 hours per month or...
I think it was 1,000 per year.
1,000 per year.
And then he kind of would break it down. I have this in my spreadsheet too. I think he has the past.
I like having that clear goal. That's something I adhere to, or I find myself drawn to, when there's very clear, this is what you have to do to say that you got it or you didn't get it.
Yeah, that can be super helpful for sure.
But it can also be a bit is it sadistic? Is that the word? Like when you're
masochistic,
masochistic.
maybe?
Yeah. Oh wait, sadistic. There's like a little bit of like, we won't go there on this one. Yeah. TVPG kids.
Yeah.
Um,
But the beauty that that you get to set what that thing is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you get to choose what that number is, what specific thing you're recording. I think that's what can make it powerful,
Mm-hmm.
right? Is that you get to choose what that thing is for you. So I'm all about that.
I love it. Doug, for people who are interested in learning more about your work, about what they don't know they could learn through or improve their life through the process of visual note taking, where should they go? Where should they find out more about you and what you do?
Yeah. I think DougNeill.com is a great place to start. DougNeill.com. And most of the work that I do is around verbal to visual, which we've talked about, which is at verbaltovisual.com. But I'm starting to take on some other projects that I'm excited about, podcast being one of them, that I think are going to continue being ways to apply the skills that I teach at Verbal to Visual in different areas. So that's why I say DougNeill.com, just because it's kind of just the home base that points to the things that I'm involved with, which is mostly just Verbal to Visual, but there could be some fun things there.
Awesome. There are many fun things there. And I think if we were to ever reconvene for round 2, I would definitely find a way to incorporate your visual notes as well, because they're a lot of fun to look at and interact with. And there's great sparks too. So I definitely recommend everybody follow Doug on the IG as well, on the Instagrams. Doug, any parting words of wisdom for anybody who's tuned in?
Oh man, I don't know that I have any. So I'll just say thanks for having this conversation. It's been a blast. I appreciate it.
Awesome. I appreciate you, Doug.
Thanks, George.
Thanks so much. Boom. Over and out, folks.
Bye, everybody.